Hi, everyone. Today we're going to go over COVID-19 infection and risk factors. This is a special topic lecture on COVID-19, specifically on how it interacts with the immune system. Basically, in this lesson, our main question we're going to address is what accounts for the wide range of symptoms and personal risk factors to COVID-19. We're not going to cover a ton of new vocabulary, though there will be some kind of complicated concepts that I'm going to introduce. All right, so just a really quick recap of viruses. Just reminding you, all viruses have genetic material that's DNA or RNA. They contain proteins that might be a capsid protein, that might be other helpful proteins and enzymes, and in particular, spike proteins depending on the virus, such as COVID-19's virus, which is actually, its name is SARS-CoV-2. All right. And the main idea for viruses is they must infect a host and use its cellular machinery to make more of themselves. They cannot reproduce and make more of themselves on their own. They need to get inside our cells to do so. Now, why do we call COVID-19's virus, SARS-CoV-2, coronaviruses? Well, this is a massive class of viruses that basically, due to the shape and presence of all their spike proteins, they kind of look like all the spikes that you might find on a crown, and corona is Latin for crown. Now, the distinctive feature is its many spike proteins on the surface of its envelope. So not all viruses have spike proteins or envelopes, but COVID-19's virus and basically all coronaviruses do. And in particular for, COVID-19's virus, SARS-CoV-2, the spikes that it has interacts with an ACE2 receptor. And we're going to go into what the ACE2 receptor does today. Now, another thing I wanted to point out is the virus for COVID-19 is what we call an SS plus RNA virus. It's actually 30,000 bases long, which is really unusually big for an RNA virus. And it's called plus sense RNA. Now, that's not a term I'm going to test you on hardcore, but what that means is not all RNA genomes in viruses are immediately usable, but for this player, for coronaviruses, theirs are. And what happens is when they dump their RNA genome into our cells immediately start treating that RNA as though it's ours and starts pumping out proteins that will help make more viruses immediately using our own cell machinery. And the other thing about this virus in particular is its recipe that it brings in for helping to copy its RNA genome. It's called RNA polymerase. That's the protein it's going to use to copy its own genome. But anyways, its particular way of copying its RNA genome actually introduces lots of mistakes. In other words, lots of mutations, which is part of the reason why coronaviruses mutate so quickly, as we're seeing with COVID-19. So this is just kind of a recap of the process, right? We have our coronavirus with its spike protein for COVID-19. Its spike protein in particular wants to find an ACE2 receptor on the host cell. When the spike protein think of it as a key, clicks into the cell receptor, think of the cell receptor as a lock, it opens a lock and allows the virus to enter our cell through this whole process. Its process is endocytosis, or sometimes called adsorption. Anyways, once it enters our cell, it allows its genome to be dumped out into our cells, which is then immediately read by our own cells' machinery, ribosomes, and that immediately starts making the genome of the virus as well as proteins for the virus, and then starts letting it assemble its virus babies, which then can exit our cells or maybe burst out of our cells. If you're curious to learn more about viruses, this is a virus explorer, and this particular page has a link that you can click when you click the image, and it will send you to like kind of this web interactive if you're really curious and want to know more about viruses. Same here. This is a chart that kind of goes into like the history of different major important viruses that affected the world. So if you're kind of really into that stuff, you can just click on this slide in particular and the graph on it, and it'll send you to a page to learn about it. But you don't have to take notes on it. All right, so what we do want to know and understand in our notes, though, is why the ACE2 receptor is so important to our body and how that basically affects what COVID-19 will do to our bodies. So the ACE2 receptor is present in a lot of our epithelial cells. Our epithelial cells, just reminding you, is the cells that kind of cover the outside of our bodies and internal structures. So the spike protein of SARS-CoV-2 engages with the ACE2 receptor of our cells to enter the host. I already said that before, but this is just formally in your notes. Now, this becomes an issue because our ACE2 receptors happens to be present in all areas of our body that utilize what we call the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, also known as RAS, R-A-A-S. Now, this is kind of an incredibly complicated system that it involves a lot of steps, and I'm not going to go really into it, but what you need to understand is it plays a major role in regulating cardiovascular health, and the kidney is super central to it. So often RAS dysfunction issues result in either cardiovascular, which is blood vessel and heart problems, or kidney problems. So what it does is if your, for example, blood pressure lowers, or if your blood pressure is too high, the RAS system will allow your blood pressure to regulate itself to a more acceptable homeostatic range to maintain your health of the blood flow in your body. And some major hormones throughout different key organs involved in the RAS system, including the kidneys, produce hormones that allow your body to make the correct response to correct your blood pressure. All right. So for example, if your blood pressure is too low, your kidneys will release renin, and then renin will actually do a bunch of different things to increase your blood pressure. All right. So what you actually need to know, though, because it's kind of a really complex system that we could spend a lot of time on, but it's actually more of an endocrine system, and I want to focus on the immune system right now. So just know it's an endocrine system, which means it uses a lot of hormones, and a lot of these hormones that help affect our blood pressure come from our liver, they come from our kidney, that's renin, they come from our lungs, which actually produce ACE, and all these things can trigger the kidney to absorb more water and salt, and also trigger your blood vessels to go from big and wide to more narrow. And this may not seem like a huge deal, but it's going to help increase your blood pressure between encouraging your kidney to take in more water and salt, as well as shrinking your blood vessels. It's going to increase your blood pressure, and higher blood pressure means that blood flows through your body more quickly and more easily. So if you have too low blood pressure, you might sometimes feel faint or fuzzy if you stand up too quickly because your blood isn't pushing through your tissues as much as it should. But very high blood pressure is also scary because if your blood pressure is too high, it constantly adds tension and force and ultimately damage to your blood vessels that might be found in your heart, might be found in your brain, and ultimately lead to organ damage. So we want our blood pressure high enough to help allow really good blood flow, but not too high so it doesn't damage our organs. All right? So that's sort of the system. Kind of complicated, and we could learn all the individual hormones and all the organs involved, but we're not going to do that. But what I do want us to understand is where ACE2 falls into this map. So if you look at this previous thing, you'll see there's angiotensinogen, angiotensin 1, and angiotensin 2. And angiotensin 2 is sort of a product within the RAS system that actually prevents the RAS system from getting out of control, prevents you from making your blood pressure too high. So what it does is it maintains that homeostasis in your blood pressure range so that it doesn't get too out of range of what's acceptable. And your ACE2 proteins are really critical to this. They actually work with angiotensin 2 within the RAS system to lower your blood pressure and help open and dilate your blood vessels. And where this becomes an issue with COVID-19 is because your tissues that need to be affected by RAS also need to prevent RAS from getting out of control, which means they also have a lot of ACE2 receptors. So any tissues involved in regulating your blood pressure and affected by blood pressure will also happen to have a lot of ACE2 receptors present, which means they're potential targets for SARS-CoV-2. So, because it's especially present in blood vessels and many organs involved in regulating blood pressure, that's why your liver, your kidneys, your heart, your lung, and your GI tract are all big targets for COVID-19 when you're infected by it. Okay? And this is actually related to the risk of getting very severely ill and potentially dying from COVID-19. So this is a list of conditions where you have a higher risk of getting hospitalized for COVID-19 compared to people without these risk factors, such as diabetes, chronic kidney disease, and we're actually not 100% sure why obesity has such a huge risk factor, whether it's just because obesity tends to be more linked to other conditions that have damaged organs that are part of the RAS system, or whether there's some other factor we don't quite understand that relates to more ACE2 receptors, but we also know obesity also is a really big risk factor. In addition to diabetes, kidney disease, hypertension just means high blood pressure, and heart conditions. Asthma has somewhat of an increased rate, though not nearly as much as being overweight, for instance. So, but asthma because of the lungs is part of the issue as well. Okay, and also because ACE2 and its receptors are such a huge area for COVID-19 to target, in instances where COVID-19 becomes really severe and causes really severe weird illness issues, you'll actually see that the organs where it kind of targets are related to the RAS system. So this possible symptoms of COVID-19 we'll go into a little bit more, but the kind of more severe COVID-19 symptoms like pneumonia and kidney failure and death are all kind of related to the RAS system. And also there's some lesser known symptoms of COVID-19 that you may not know, such as diarrhea, because it's ACE2 is found in your GI tract. So they're all kind of related. Oh, and I wanted to mention this little factor here when I talk about the kidneys is actually you may not have heard about it, but actually kidney failure is a really big issue for people who are hospitalized with really severe COVID. And a lot of those people may need temporary dialysis because their kidneys stop functioning during their severe illness, or they may even need potentially permanent dialysis for the rest of their life. The dialysis industry that produces the machines for filtering your blood when your kidneys aren't working, they're actually having really good stocks now because everyone's anticipating them to have a lot of business due to COVID-19 long-term symptoms for really severe cases, the people who got hospitalized. All right, so because of the ACE2 and the issues with blood pressure, this actually accounts for why older people tend to have a higher risk of infection and severity for illness. Because ACE2 is associated with lowering your blood pressure, you're going to actually express more ACE2 and contain more ACE2 receptors if you are more prone to high blood pressure, which is going to happen to older people compared to younger people, okay? Another thing is because older people tend to have weaker innate immunity, we're also more likely to allow the virus to enter our bodies versus younger people. In addition, like I mentioned, because we just typically have higher blood pressure and more health issues regarding organs in our RAS system, we're also going to have a lot more ACE2 activity and receptors for SARS-CoV-2 to enter. If you're younger, you don't nearly have as much. And in fact, before puberty, you have a very low amount of ACE2 receptors. At some point in your teen years after puberty, you start to really express a lot of ACE2 receptors. So actually, by the time you're a teen, your infection rate is pretty much very close to those that are in their 20s, younger adults. But very young kids have very low amount of ACE2 receptors. though they can still get COVID, just not as easily as older people. All right. In addition to that, there are some medications, such as medication that lowers your blood pressure and other treatments for organs related to the RAS system. And some of them are actually known to increase the presence of your ACE2 receptors. And they discovered that during the COVID-19 outbreak. So doctors are tending to try to avoid prescribing those medications to their patients whenever possible. And finally, just because when you're older, you've had more time to damage your body. And oftentimes, a lot of the damage may occur in your RAS system or RAS system organs, like your blood vessels, for example, or your lungs, because you've done stuff. So just in general, because COVID-19 is targeting those tissues, if those tissues are already weakened and damaged because of your activities and in your life, you're going to be more likely to get ill and have a severe illness from COVID-19. All right. In addition to that, there is a genetic factor to potentially getting a severe illness from COVID-19. Some people genetically just express a lot of ACE2 receptors, and sometimes the shape, the slight variation of how you form your ACE2 receptor might be just in particular really good at connecting and being vulnerable to COVID-19 spike, right? We all have slightly different hair shapes or tones of skin. You can also have slightly different shapes of your ACE2 receptor. And in this case, that could be very bad if it's just particularly one that is good at attaching to the spike protein in COVID-19's virus SARS-CoV-2. Another thing you may not realize is ACE2 and its receptors are actually found within neurons and glial cells in your nervous system. So why is that important? Well, for example, because it's an aerosol or respiratory illness, the virus spreads through the air, which means it is likely to come into contact with parts of your body that breathe it in. And in fact, one of the first neurons it interacts with is the neurons in your nose, which is your olfactory neurons. And because they have ACE2 receptors, they can get damaged and infected by SARS-CoV-2, which means you might get anosmia, which is the loss of smell and potentially taste, because your sense of smell is connected to taste. In addition, it can target your brain if it gets to your brain, which is actually why fatigue is a really common COVID-19 symptom, and actually one of the most common COVID-19 symptoms that lingers even after you recover from the virus. But eventually, especially for smell, it will come back. And it's been shown that even though fatigue can be very present and even very long lasting in people that recover or that are no longer infected by COVID-19's virus, it's one of the most common lingering symptoms after you recover from illness. Eventually, the fatigue usually lessens and fades away. All right, so 3 factors for viral infection symptoms: the severity of your symptoms and the chances of you being infected. One of them is just having those receptors present, which has a big component due to your genetics and due to your health to an extent, because your health may lead to higher expression of it or just due to the medications you take. In addition to that, just having the virus in your body so it can get to the tissues with ACE2 receptor is really a huge factor. So 2 things affect how much virus is in your system at any given time. One is your immune system health, which is the ability to block and remove the virus. That's part of the reason why cancer patients are really vulnerable to COVID-19, because they have treatments that actually weaken their immune system. In addition, viral load is really important. So meaning the more virus you take in, the more likely that virus will get into your bloodstream, will get into your cells, will then be able to reproduce and then go on to infect more cells. So actually, it looks like by wearing masks, you reduce the amount of virus you may take in, and also reducing the scenarios and the amount of virus you may be exposed to. All those things, even if it doesn't 100% protect you from COVID-19, it looks like it has a pretty big effect on at least lowering the severity of your illness, even if it doesn't 100% protect you from getting sick. It'll lower and make it more weak, more likely to be asymptomatic than something that might land you in a hospital, for instance. All right. Now, in addition to that, if you do get infected by the virus, there are a few things to watch out for. All right. So we have our immune system. We have our levels of immunity, innate immunity, and acquired immunity. Well, one part of your innate immunity in your second line of defense is your cellular defenses that's non-specific, and one of them is cytokines. So cytokines, if you forgot, are the signals that are sent out by your white blood cells and tissues to recruit and stimulate white blood cells to the site of infection. Cytokines actually also have a huge role in your fever regulation because it signals and interacts with your hypothalamus to raise your body temperature, which is actually interferes with the ability for your bacteria and virus to replicate. But one of the weird side symptoms for some people with COVID-19 is something called a cytokine storm. So what happens is sometimes the cytokine effect, which is supposed to help increase your immune system, kind of overstimulates your immune system to a dangerous degree where it creates lots of swelling and lots of cell damage, which can actually sometimes lead to death. This is a very rare condition, but it does have an impact on the people that happen to die from COVID-19 or become hospitalized from COVID-19, because for some reason, this virus, especially this virus in particular, is more likely to trigger cytokine storms in patients compared to other normally common viruses that are found in the population, like flu virus. And of course, we have our normal immune system response, our acquired immune system, specific immune system responses. And there's nothing too special to this. It's just we have either an antigen presenting cell or maybe an infected cell helping to stimulate our helper T cells, which will go on to stimulate our B cells to make antibodies, and our cytotoxic T cells to attack infected cells so that you are no longer sick, to help get rid of the virus. So this you don't need to take notes on. It's just to remind you your acquired immune system is also really important for attacking the virus as well. All right, now how SARS-CoV-2 spreads. In these slides, I have a lot of videos that kind of go over how SARS-CoV-2 spreads through sneezing and things like that. But later in our unit or within our unit, we're going to learn about a factor called R0, which is the basic reproduction rate of a virus, which measures how contagious a disease is by measuring how many people an afflicted person will infect. What that means is, if you are sick, will you infect one other person? Will you infect 3 other people? Will you maybe infect 12 other people? That's the R0 number, the average amount a person will infect if they have that disease. All right. If one person is capable of infecting 1 or more people on average, then you're actually going to have exponential spread of a disease. But if one person it will infect less than one person, meaning like out of 2 people being sick, they'll go on between the 2 people, they might infect only one other person between the 2 of them. Then what that means is over time, the disease will fade out. Now, this is kind of hard to predict accurately because social factors are involved in this. For example, the R0 when in a society where no one is doing any social distancing is very different than a society where people typically wear masks very commonly, even with or without a pandemic. Okay? And also, in addition to this has a really important effect on social health structures and considerations by epidemiologists, people who study the spread of disease and make recommendations regarding the government's response to an illness, because viruses with really high R values actually need very high vaccination rates and immunity in order for that disease to be eliminated from a population. So, for example, these are different R0s of different outbreaks. And for SARS-CoV-2, it looks like we're kind of in the 2 to 4 range, meaning one person may go on to infect 2 to 4 people. And that number you're going to learn means we need a fairly high rate of vaccination to permanently eradicate the disease from a population. Otherwise, likely what's going to happen is it's always going to be present, though hopefully weakened over time due to vaccines. But we're going to, instead of being one and done with the vaccine, it is likely we're going to need constant boosters to the vaccine over our lifetime to address COVID-19 in the population. You kind of see this with measles. Measles has a really high R0 value of 12 to 18. So in fact, this is why measles was kind of the first disease to make a comeback, even though we used to never think of measles before the 90s when the anti-vax movement happened. Because as soon as the numbers dropped below 95%, measles started poking its head out and started showing up in our population. Just because the R0 value was so high, you needed a really high rate of vaccination to get rid of measles, which we no longer have as high a rate as we need for that. Okay, so then again, for these slides, there's a bunch of videos on COVID tracking and things like that if you want to read more on that. But we're going to learn more about it in our class. This is a map of COVID-19's case spread, and if you're curious about looking at the stats of how it's spread around the world, you can look at Johns Hopkins map and website on that. And if you click this map, you'll actually get connected to the link for that website. On that note, that concludes our lesson for the day. Bye.